Montesquieu's treatment of Constantine shows, as I say, that Constantine was not so great. Interestingly, however, Montesquieu pretty much leaves Constantine's greatest or most notable achievement, the conversion of the empire to Christianity, out of his discussion. As we saw in the last video, Montesquieu seems to blame Christianity for a new kind of decadence in Rome, the decadence of a different kind of tyranny, as he says. The manner of the people became less warlike, more indolent, more repressive and factious on particular issues. He does not explicitly trace these things to Christianity in the context of discussing Constantine. Constantine just comes off as a vain, stupid ruler in Montesquieu's treatment. Montesquieu has also shown that Christianity is not responsible for the decline or decadence of Rome from its height. Montesquieu brings up the issue of Christianity and politics somewhat obliquely only at the beginning of chapter 19. And let us look at chapter 19. The title of the chapter says that it will be about three different things. 1. Attila's greatness. 2. Cause of the settlement of the barbarians. And 3. Reasons why the Western emperor was the first to fall. But then we look at the beginning of chapter 19, and we see a few paragraphs on the fundamental issue of how Christianity relates to the decadence of the empire. And the discussion is very odd. The first thing you notice about how Montesquieu takes the general question of of how Christianity relates to Rome's decline and translates it into, did Christianity lead to the sack of Rome by Alaric the Visigoth in 415 AD? The claims of the Christians are narrowed to a critique of Diocletian and his effort to divide the empire, just as the claims of the pagans in defense of Rome are narrowed. Then Montesquieu gets to the debate itself. He presents the pagan argument in a speech from Symmachus, who simply says that Rome was sacked as an act of divine justice by the pagan gods. That is, because Rome, had abandoned the pagan gods. Montesquieu calls this the most popular, and hence the most seductive objection to the Christian religion. But he does not say it is the best objection, nor does the presentation of Rome's history bear this way of thinking out in any way that Symmachus would endorse. After relating Symmachus's argument, Montesquieu relates three Christian responses to it. And the Christian responses emphasize first how Rome was already decadent, just as Montesquieu had pretty much argued, and how Rome's internal disorder attracted the barbarians, something Montesquieu also has argued. Third, Montesquieu mentions St. Augustine, who claimed that the decline of Rome wasn't such a big deal because the genuine rewards of human virtue lay beyond death. Then Montesquieu, without comment, just drops the discussion entirely and goes to his discussion of Attila, whom he soon calls one of the great monarchs of history. What are we to make of this strange way of proceeding? Montesquieu generally argues early in the book that it was not the ancient Romans' gods that brought it success, but the pride and patriotism instilled by traditional Roman religion had helped the Romans help themselves. The justification for paganism for Montesquieu is its ability to instill a love of country in the Romans. Consider this from chapter 10. Aside from the fact that religion is always the best guarantee one can have of the morals of man, it was a special trait of the Romans that they mingled their religious sentiment with their love of country. This city, founded under the best auspices, this Romulus, their king and their god, this capital, eternal like the city, and this city, eternal like its founder. These, in earlier times, had made the impression on the minds of the Romans, which it would have been desirable to preserve. So it would have been desirable to preserve paganism as a political force and for its political implications. This does not mean that Rome declined because it adopted another religious pose. Rome declined because of Rome's political trajectory, the somewhat ineluctable laws of political gravity, whereby the virtues of a political community lead to its successes that undermine those virtues and lead to vices. But the fact that Rome declined politically does not mean that for Montesquieu, Christianity is a salutary political force. Montesquieu wants to instruct us about the trajectory or patterns of political regimes, and he does this through his consideration of the Romans, especially in the first two-thirds of the book. Another part about what Montesquieu would instruct us in is the political implications of Christianity, and this is what the last third of the book or so concerns. Montesquieu's real antagonist here is St. Augustine. When Montesquieu relates the Christian response to the popular pagan arguments, it is the only time in the book that he mentions St. Augustine by name. Montesquieu writes this: St. Augustine showed that the city of heaven was different from this earthly city, in which the ancient Romans, for some human virtues, had received rewards that were as vain as these virtues. Montesquieu admirably reduces St. Augustine's argument into one very accurate sentence. If one wanted to put Augustine's tome into one sentence, could one do better than Montesquieu here? Probably not. And then Montesquieu drops the topic entirely, as I say, and starts talking about Attila. Augustine praises the Roman passion for glory, the mark of political men, for it is higher than what usually motivates human beings. This desire for glory checks lower desires and leads to an improvement in human life. The love of glory drove the Romans to make incredible sacrifices, to think of others rather than themselves, and these are indeed admirable traits. But ultimately, those virtues are inferior, resplendent vices, St. Augustine calls them. And this is Augustine's central point: the denigration of pagan virtues around the love of glory in light of the eternal human destiny. Thus it seems that Rome could not really run the experiment about the effects of Christianity. One would need a Rome that was born with Christianity, and then one would need to compare that Rome to the Rome that actually existed, a Rome born without Christianity. But then Montesquieu actually conducts the experiment. The entire book up until this point, and really up until the end of chapter 19, has been about the decline of what we call the West. And the West was decadent not because it was Christian, but because of those political cycles. Now, right at the end, Montesquieu conducts the experiment where Christianity is sown into the Eastern Empire at its onset, with Constantine and later with Justinian. We can see its political effects throughout the empire of the East. We get to compare the Christian separation of church and state as it exists in the East with the unity of pagan religion and patriotism as it existed in the West. We get to compare the tough guy politics and the affable pagan politicians with the merciful politics and the intolerant politicians among those in the East. In the East, we see an empire born in Christian faith. We see how it treats different sects and factions. We see its dispositions to political rule. We see how it conducts foreign policy. We see its vision of political unity. It is in the East, somewhat counterintuitively, that we see the teaching of St. Augustine most followed, if least known. And we see what we see in this Augustinian policy is, in Montesquieu's view, not good for politics at all. We see this experiment run in chapters. Chapter 20 concerns Justinian, the great Eastern emperor from 527 to 565 AD. Justinian is known in the business as Justinian the Great. But once again, Montesquieu does not consider him to be so great. Part of the reason for this becomes clear in chapter 21, entitled Disorders in the Eastern Empire. Montesquieu's judgment about Justinian, or rather his condemnation of Justinian, is a signally interesting event in the book. I want to end this video with a small snippet from a podcast on the history of Byzantium, the 12 Byzantine emperors, from Lars Brownworth. This podcast contains a very different view of Justinian than we see in Montesquieu. Listen to this, and then read chapter 20 and notice the vast difference.
And yet, somehow, only 27 years after Zeno's death, the most splendid of all Byzantine emperors would arise, with a virtual explosion of power, conquest, and culture, in the most universally brilliant period of Byzantine history. It was in many ways similar to the Renaissance, condensed into one reign, with a confluence of great minds and personalities in virtually every arena. It not only saw a dazzling emperor and empress, it saw the greatest legal mind, the greatest historian, the greatest architect, and the greatest general of the age. But this cultural revolution, this Byzantine Renaissance, was driven by one man, whose tireless work ethic gave him the nickname, the Emperor Who Never Sleeps. And it is to Justinian, and Justinian alone, that much of the credit, as well as the blame, is due for what was accomplished in his reign. I suppose it's only fair to tell you that Justinian is my favorite Byzantine emperor. There's something endearing in the story of a man who couldn't help dreaming larger than other men. You get the feeling that Justinian would say, if you're gonna fail, fail grandly. He wasn't just going to live in the world, he was going to change it.
Our next video will concern Montesquieu's critique of Justinian and its meaning for the book as a whole.